Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm not sure what time you are watching this presentation. But anyway, Philippine history in a nutshell. Though I mentioned that I will be answering some of your questions that you posted on our Google stream, but I noticed that many of you is actually having a hard time in grasping the context of the readings that I gave you. So, hence, that's the reason why I think it's best that we have a little review about Philippine history. That's why the title on your screen, you have Philippine history in a nutshell. So, on the first slide, you have here the pre colonial civilization. So, prior to 1565. So, ibig sabihin, before 1565, it is considered as pre-colonial civilization. So what you have on your screen is actually the traditional timeline or time frame that you can read in most of our Philippine history textbooks. Then 1565 to 1898, you have the archipelago or the Philippines during the Spanish regime. So that's 333 years. Then American entry and colonization, 1898 to 1946. But there's an interlude when the Japanese arrive in 1941 to 1945. Then we have Philippines as a sovereign nation, 1946 up to the present. So we'll try to discuss later why you have 1946. So this is the traditional time frame that you will see on most of the Philippine history textbooks. But as Mindanaoans also, we kind of have a little more of this. So in your second screen, you have there the three historical streams. So you have the Filipino perspective, Moro narratives, and the Lumans. So usually from, as mentioned earlier, from the usual textbook that we have the arrival of Magellan. So this is usually the usual narrative. He introduced Christianity. Then in 1565, Spanish colonization began. So when the Spaniards arrived, does not mean that our ancestors just welcomed them. So many did, but at the same time, there were also uprising. So if you actually read Agoncillo's book, he mentioned that before the 1896 revolution, our ancestors already staged more than 100 revolts and uprising. So that's why you have here on your screen 16th to the 9th century revolts. And then in 1896, you have Philippine Revolution. Ito yung revolution na sinimula ni na Andres Bonifacio. Then 1898, abortion of the Philippine Infant Republic. Philippine Republic through the Treaty of Paris. So bakit abortion of the infant Philippine Republic? Alam naman natin that you have Aguinaldo who declared independence in 1898. But unfortunately, when the Americans arrived and they declared war against Spain, natalo yung mga Espanyol, and since we were a colony of Spain at the time, ang demand ng mga Americans was actually to get the Philippines as their new colony. In fact, the Philippines was the first colony of America. But in the middle, you have also the Moro narrative. So, from the Moro narrative, usually do not start with the arrival of Magellan. They will start with the arrival of Islam. So, some books would say that the arrival of Islam was in 1380. Some books would say it's earlier than 1380. So, many historians would say to be safe, let's use 14th century. Then the Sulu Sultanate was also born in 1450. Then eventually Islam also arrived in mainland Mindanao. Then after that, there was also the emergence of the Maguindanao Sultanate. Then in 1898, the two sultanates, whether it's the Sulu Sultanate and the Maguindanao Sultanate, they remain independent until the Treaty of Paris. Bakit Treaty of Paris pala yung tawag? Because doon nag-meet yung Espanya at saka yung Amerika sa Paris where they not June, December 10 on 1898, where America demanded from Spain that they will get the Philippines as their colony since natalo yung Espanya, and nagbayad sila ng $20 million to Spain. Then in return, Spain ceded Philippines to America. Then from the Lumad narrative, they would always say, since time immemorial, nandito na sa Mindanao yung mga ancestors nila. Some narrative would say that some may have been tributary to the Moro Sultanates, but they maintained their independence. So from the 16th up to the 19th century, they kept their distance from Filipinas. So we're referring here, when you say Filipinas, it was when the Philippines was under the Spaniards. Then, unfortunately, 1898 forcibly integrated into the Philippines. And then, since we discussed about these three historical streams or the narratives in the Philippine about Philippine history, and colonization was a very big part of it. So I think it's best that we will also know why the Spaniards, why the colonizers came to the country. So here, the coming of the West, so the archipelago during the Spanish regime, 1565 to 1898. So ano yung mga pangyayari sa Europa? Why it allowed them to go or to venture into exploration and expansion. So here, maraming nangyari sa Europa, but we can capsulize it into four. So you have political stability, economic prosperity, scientific development, and growing European interest in the Orient. So ibig sabihin, since we mentioned about changes in Europe, we mentioned about political stability, so ibig sabihin, Europe also experienced political instability. They also experienced economic crisis. And since there was political instability, there was not so much about economic prosperity, so wala masyado ding scientific development. So this was like a domino effect. When they experienced political stability, it led to economic prosperity, then also led to scientific development, and all of this development caused them to have more interest to the Orient or to Asia. So here, with the political stability, actually, as I mentioned kanina, that they experienced political instability. So bakit instability? Kasi right after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, Europe entered to what we call Dark Ages. So itong Dark Ages, this is the period of characterized as being where Europe experienced stagnation and ignorance. Pero alam naman natin that this is from the context of the Europeans. They said Europe entered into dark ages. But if you talk about Asia, it was also a different story. It was not dark ages with the experience of Asia. In fact, if you have those archaeological evidences, you will notice that from the 9th century up to the 13th century, trade was so flourishing in Asia. So iba yung narrative natin. But from the period, some parts of Europe, they said they experienced dark ages. And during this time, Germanic tribes invade the different parts of Europe and destroyed almost all the vestiges of the Roman and Greek civilization. And during this time, since medyo hindi stable yung politics nila, meron lang tinatawag na feudalism, kung saan yung mga feudal lords were absolute rulers. So bakit ito yung part na tinatawag natin hindi stable yung politics nila. Kasi yung mga feudal lords, pag may mga kaaway sila, it was easy for them to drag their subjects to fight their wars. Kaya hindi talaga hindi siya ganun ka, if you talk about peace and order, hindi siya ganun ka okay. But eventually, after 1,000 years, in the 15th century, Europe also witnessed the birth of consolidated monarchies. Example, yung United Kingdom, sa Great Britain, yung Kingdom of Spain, Portugal, France, and other kingdoms in Europe. So example, in Great Britain, ito yung consolidation ng dalawang rival kingdoms, yung Lancaster at saka York. Then sa Espanya naman, nag-asawa yung dalawang monarch ng dalawang kingdom. You have Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. So because of this consolidation of kingdoms, it led them to have more peace and order. So it led to political stability and then also led to economic prosperity. So here in the 15th century also witnessed the revival, hindi siya rival, revival of science in Europe. So ito yung revival of science na to, it led to the improvement of European arms, improvement of navigational instrument, and invention of the printing machine. Actually, the printing machine, if you go to China, mas advanced sila, mas matagal na na-develop yung printing machine. But in Europe, basically it was in the 15th century. So bakit importante itong mga improvements na ito? Kasi it was not really safe to travel before. Maraming mga pirates sa karagatan. Maraming mga magnanakaw sa lupa. So improvements of European arms was a necessity or important if you go for a travel before. Then improvements of navigational instrument, importante yun. Mas nainganyo silang maglakbay kasi sure silang they have a proper instrument to guide their journey. Then invention of printing machine. So since may mga travel accounts na hindi na ilimbag before, but when the machine was invented, nagkaroon ng printing itong mga narratives na ito, itong mga chronicles, mga accounts na ito. So one example is you have the Venetian traveler named Marco Polo, where he was able to visit Asia twice in the 13th century. First in 1271, then next was in 1295. So he was able to document his experiences. Some would say some of his accounts were a little bit exaggerated. Exaggerated man or hindi, his accounts was some of the factors that caused some of the Europeans to also really want to travel to Asia. So, and then aside from that, that led to the exploration and expansion of the Europeans was the Muslim-Christian relationship. Yung relationship ng dalawang relihiyon deteriorated due to the European Crusades. So itong mga Crusades na to, these are religious expedition. Yung objective is to regain lands controlled by the Muslims. And then the other one is the fall of Constantinople. Ito yung Turkey ngayon. So this city played a very important role sa trade route papuntang Europa, papuntang Asia. If you have your world map, you can picture out Turkey or Constantinople before. Part of it is very close to Asia, and part of it is very close to Europe, and a big part is of course in Asia. So most of the Europeans merchants would use the route from they will dadaan sila sa Constantinople, then they can go to Asia. But when there was because of the fall of Constantinople, ang resulta nito, trade routes to the east was blocked. Hence, discovery of new routes to Asia became a necessity. So you have two Iberian kingdoms, Portugal and Spain. When most of the Eastern Europe, mas malapit sa Asia, they can actually access using the Constantinople route going to Asia. But since it was blocked, it gave another opportunity for other kingdoms to find for new trade routes. So these two Iberian kingdoms were facing a vast ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. So the vast ocean was an opportunity for them to find a new trade route going to Asia. But of course, at that time, it was mahirap siyang gawin din. Pero, meron silang because of the development of the navigational tools and instruments. So, mas confident sila. The first one to actually send expedition was Portugal. So the first one to send an expedition that attempted at exploring and finding new trade routes to reach the Orient or Asia. So ang pinakaano nila dito, you have Prince Henry the Navigator. He even built navigational schools, and they were became successful. So ang ano dito in 1498, you have Vasco da Gama. He successfully found a route going to India. So ginawa nila, if you try to imagine, so you have Europe, and then sa baba niyan you have Africa. So ang ginawa ng mga Portuguese is they go down south and then inikot nila yung buong kontinente ng Africa. Then eventually they found themselves in the Indian Ocean and eventually reached India. They were able to have access to the spices. And then at the same time, sa Espanya naman, hindi naman naging ano lang, naging tawag ito, hindi walang ginawa yung Espanya. They did not just wait and see what will happen or the success of Portugal. They also sent their expedition. You have Christopher Columbus. He's tried to travel from going to the west and try to reach the east. And then, bakit gusto nilang ma-access yung trade routes? So here, you have three oriental products that are very in demand in Europe. You have spices, silk, and ceramics. So particularly the spices, it was very in demand. Kasi most of the spices are not only, hindi lang siya ginagamit pang luto. Some of the spices has medicinal value. Pwede siya gawing gamot. Some also of the spices, aside sa pwede siya maging gamot, it can also be a preservative. It actually napapahaba niya yung shelf life ng mga meat. Especially yung kung taglamig. Kasi kung sa Europa, some of the farmers were forced to slaughter their animals. So para hindi masayang, so the spices played a very important role to preserve the meat. So kaya ganun siya ka-in demand. So I will not go so much detail for that about the expedition, but I'll go on. But you have another link where you have another video where you can see the different expedition, particularly the Magellan's expedition. So because of this, you have the two rival kingdoms, Spain and Portugal. So when the Portugal kingdom, when the Portuguese were successful in reaching Asia, and also Spain started to send their expedition, they requested the Pope at the time na magkaroon ng malinaw na demarcation kung saan ba talaga yung exploration and expansion ng Long Kingdom. So that's why you have Alexander the Sixth. He issued the Intercaetera, the papal bull which divided the world into two spheres of influence. So all the land lying to the east will be for the exploration and expansion of Portugal. All the land lying to the west is for Spain. So Spain continued to send their expedition. So as far as the Philippines is concerned, so first Magellan started the expedition in Sanlúcar, Spain. He was given by the King of Spain 5 ships. You have Trinidad, Concepcion, Victoria, Santiago, San Antonio. So he convinced the King of Spain that he can reach the east by sailing west. Then the expedition sighted Humonhon, and then unfortunately for Magellan, and fortunately for the people of Mactan, natalo si Magellan. But as after the defeat of Magellan, alam naman natin that they were able to go back to Spain, considered as the first expedition that was able to circumnavigate the world. Ang Espanya, kasi yung laman ng baliit na barko na nakabalik, kasi not all the 5 ships were able to go back to Spain. Isa lang yung Victoria. But the content of that ship was more than enough to pay for the whole expedition. That's why Spain tried to send more expeditions. So you have Villalobos expedition in 1542. It was during this expedition that Bernardo de la Torre, yung kasamahan ni Villalobos sa expedition, coined the term Filipinas in honor of the Spanish crown prince, Prince Philip. And then in 1564, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi was sent from Mexico with the ultimate instruction of colonizing the Philippines. So at this time, Mexico was a colony of Spain. And many of the expeditions that came to the Philippines actually started in Mexico. In fact, we have 250 years of history with Mexico. Then, when they were able to come to Philippines, first in the Legazpi expedition, first they were able to establish a settlement in Cebu, then they transferred to Panay. Then, when they were able to establish a settlement in Panay, he requested his men, but with the leadership of Martin de Guete, to explore further north. So sa north na yon, doon nila nahanap yung fortified city, the city of Manila, ruled by a Muslim chief. So upon the suggestion of de Guete, Legazpi then transferred his headquarters to the new town in 1571. So in 1571, they declared Manila as the new capital of the new colony, the Philippines. So this is how the Spaniards were able to gain foothold in the Philippines. So De Guete, ano ba nangyari kay De Guete with the Muslim chief in Manila? So at first, they were received as friends. Then when the group of the Guete started to extract tribute from the people of Manila. So they realized that if they will give in to the demands of the Guete, they will reduce their position to subjects. So hindi pumayag yung mga chief ng Manila. Yung pinaka-prominent na pangalan na palaging tinababasa, you have Raja Sulaiman. So ang ginawa ni De Guete, bumalik siya sa Panay, telling Legazpi that we found this nice place in the north. Unfortunately, it is ruled by a Muslim chief who will not give in to our demands. So ginawa nila, together with, kasi alam naman nila De Guete, that they were outnumbered. Kung kakalabanin nila sila Sulaiman, matatalo sila. So they went back to Panay. So with the approval of Legazpi, so they brought with them the Islamized natives of Panay to fight against the Islamized natives of Manila. So because of that, parang doon nagsimula yung parang Christian-Muslim um, conflict, which tingnan mo, it has nothing to do with religion. It has something to do with these colonizers who wants to colonize. So there, unfortunately, natalo sina Sulaiman. And in 1571, Legazpi was able to declare that the Philippines, the new colony of the Spaniards, and Manila is the capital. So we will have more discussions about Philippine history on the next video. Hope you learned from this, and we'll try to discuss more after during the regime of the Spaniards on the next presentation. So thank you.